I was doing some cleaning and some meal prep, listening to the Titanic soundtrack, and I love the music on that soundtrack. The movie's pretty good too, but I was always bothered about the ending and always wondered why Rose didn't at least try to make a little bit of space on the door for Jack. But I guess it wouldn't have been so romantic at the end if he didn't freeze to death. But when you think about the ending of that movie, the Titanic ship, the structure, the stability that was supposed to keep the larger population protected, the safety net, failed. It started falling apart. And it was those that jumped ship and got in little tiny flimsy rafts in the dark, cold ocean without any navigation or know-how, without any resources, no idea if they would be rescued. It was those that took that risk and floated it alone that ended up being saved, that ended up being survivors. And in our society, we have these structures in place, these safety nets, these systems, the court system, child protective services, law enforcement, systems that are intended to protect, to keep us safe, to provide stability in our communities. And unfortunately, abusers will engage in abuse by proxy by misusing these systems, by triangulating these systems to further victimize a victim. So, for example, if a victim leaves an abusive partner, even though they may have gotten away, that need for power and control still very much exists for that abuser. And what better way for them to further harass and terrorize and abuse and maintain power and control over that victim than to use the legal system or any of those other systems aforementioned. And this is very common, and unfortunately we see this in legal harassment where a perpetrator, whether it be an abusive family member, an abusive former partner, it could be someone from the community, it could be someone even from a position of power that's misusing their power and weaponizing systems to victimize a victim. But we'll see the legal harassment with the filing of meritless lawsuits and meritless civil cases intended to drag that victim into court to defend themselves, to deplete them of resources financially if they're trying to, obtain an attorney, because often the perpetrator will have an attorney, but the victim won't be able to afford one, or if they can, those resources get depleted rather quickly by frivolous motions being filed by the perpetrator's attorney. And it's a lot of stress and emotional depletion, time away from work that is, subjected toward the victim and impacting their life in every area of their life. Or you could have a stalker that is filing court cases in order to get that victim into court so they can see them, further harassing them. And you'll see this in custody cases where there will be repetitive motions to modify custody, keeping that victim in court for years on end for the majority of those children's lives. There is ongoing custody litigation, and it's never intended for the best interest of the children because litigation certainly isn't in their best interest. But this parent over here, who had very little involvement generally when the parties were together, suddenly becomes parent of the year and wants sole custody or increased time in the court system so that they can hurt the other parent because they know that that's what's most precious to them, their identity as a parent, that parent-child bond. So what better way to hurt them than to obstruct that? And B, to negate their child support obligations. The more time they get, the less they feel that it will cost them. And so victims will find themselves dealing with modification after modification. They'll also see that with increased efforts to reduce child support. I know in my situation, when I left my abuser, he made very clear that he would sit in prison for MURDER before he would ever provide support. And I believed that to be true because of the high lethality abuse that had already been occurring. And so I agreed through intimidation through his attorney that I would sign off that he would pay $0 in child support, but would instead pay a small portion of my mortgage, or a portion of the mortgage, directly to the mortgage company. But unbeknownst to me, that would also mean he would keep his name on the house. I was grateful to be able to keep a roof over the heads of my children and maintain that stability. But what it meant is that my abuser would come and go on the property, enter my home, take things at will. And when I would call the police to get help because there was a restraining order, they would say, well, this is his house. He would show them the deed and I'd have no recourse. And it was quite difficult. And then, it became year after year going back to court for more and more time, decreased child support, going on workman's comp every year, saying that there had been a reduction of income, literally dedicating life to negating any kind of financial responsibility for the children. And, parental alienation becomes a big issue in these cases because often the abuser will flip the script and project their own behavior onto the victim. And so now suddenly this parent over here is being accused of neglect and attacked in their abilities to parent and their stability and abuse and whatever this parent has been doing, they'll start accusing this parent of. So now this parent is left defending themselves as a parent when they're the stability for the children. And, this parent is fighting for more time with the children, yet works away for months at a time. So those children are sitting there alone and neglected for months at a time without any supervision. Meanwhile, you have a fully capable, loving parent over here that is wishing to have that time with them. And they're doing it just to hurt that other parent, and it's the kids that suffer in the middle of it. And these systems, we'll see this with Child Protective Services, again, with false allegations. And now suddenly a parent is having to jump through hoops, going through investigations and interventions, and their life is filled with classes and requirements and things that they need to do in order to have a meager amount of time with their children, which can be so discouraging and heartbreaking. And what happens is now you have a larger community and systems that are affecting the way the children see that parent because they're being treated as less than. The parent with the perceived power is being seen as definitely having that perceived power, and this parent being treated as less than, that they have less rights, less bond, less priority in the children's lives. It will impact the way those children see that parent and that parent-child relationship. And, in parental alienation situations, this is an increasing epidemic in these cases. And, some of us have had our kids kidnapped and taken across state lines and hidden from us. And had a stranger done that, we would have had help from law enforcement in the system. But because the other parent did it, we were left without recourse, depending on the jurisdiction you're coming from. And, whether it's Child Protective Services or a child custody investigator or the court system, having a keen eye and continual training on red flags and patterns in this alienation behavior, in this abuse by proxy practice, is so important for the benefit of the children. It really impacts their lifelong bond with their other parent if the system is not supportive of that relationship. And it, is a dead giveaway if a child is openly vocal, speaking negatively about one of their parents. It's because they're not afraid of that parent, and they know that even if they say bad things, that parent's going to forgive them and still love them unconditionally, and there's a safety there. The parent that they don't feel safe with, that is instigating those verbalizations, they would never say anything bad about because they're too afraid. And, that goes undetected so often in these cases, and it's just so devastating because it destroys families, it destroys bonds, it destroys lives. And we see this with, the false Child Protective Services cases. We can see this with false police reports and false law enforcement investigations that were erroneous because of these claims that were meritless. And there's a social stigma that comes with that. It harasses an individual. Suddenly a victim who's left an abusive situation is now being targeted and essentially stalked by the community or law enforcement or fighting the system that's supposed to be their protection, and now they're having to protect themselves from the very systems that are in place to protect them. We'll also see this where abusive family members will use law enforcement out of concern to do welfare checks. And this is intended to verify the location of that victim so that they can stalk and harass them. Usually that family member is trying to stay hidden from an abuser or a stalker or a family member, and they'll make those calls of concern to locate them and to verify where they are so they can further abuse them. And we will see this in probate court, where thousands upon thousands of us are having our inheritance stolen from us or property stolen from us because family members are showing up in court and saying, yeah, we served them, we notified them, they just didn't show up. Or yeah, they have a drug problem, or they're facing criminal charges that we, called in ourselves to get them investigated, or whatever targeting they're doing to smear the name of that family member to disqualify them from their inheritance so they get a larger portion or can take their portion. And it's baffling to me, again, if judges on the bench are hearing probate cases day in and day out, how is so much fraud being just simply signed off? How is so much theft occurring? Why are there not systems and more procedures being put into place to ensure that this kind of thing is not happening when there's so many of us experiencing it? And I would just encourage those who have been through these endless levels of injustice repetitively, because once you experience one, it's like a domino effect. You get involved with one system and then multiple systems start attacking. You become unraveled and ingrained in all these different issues in all these different areas of your life. And it can be so overwhelming. And where do you turn when the systems that are there to protect you and help you are the ones that are doing the opposite? And I would just encourage you to remember that those that were alone in the dark, cold, flimsy rafts in the middle of the ocean, though it was scary and lonely and you didn't know what direction to go or what to do, those were the ones that made it. Those were the ones that survived. They had the survival skills. They had the ability to take the risk. They didn't have anyone to rely on and to help them until the time of rescue came. But they made it. And I would just encourage those that are experiencing these issues to not forget that you will make it. And I plea for systems to really invest in continuing education on these issues, because inheritance theft is an epidemic. Parental alienation is an epidemic. False investigations, false allegations, false claims, these are an epidemic being used by targeters, by gang stalkers. There has got to be an awareness and a light brought to these issues. And ironically, those that are corrupt in these situations expose themselves because they attack those of us that try to give voice to these issues. You can tell by our attackers who the corrupt players are, because they come for the warriors of social justice. They come for the advocates, the one that give voice to these issues. Because often those being targeted, those being stolen from, those having their rights violated are the black sheep of the family that don't have a strong family support system. They tend to not have a lot of financial resources to defend and protect themselves. They tend to be the ones that have a hard time articulating in a clear way that's believable what's happening to them. So they become easy targets. And you'll notice patterns amongst those that do experience targeting. There's a lot of similarities in our stories and what's happening to us. It's uncanny how similar some of these cases are and how prevalent these problems are. But please don't forget that even though you feel alone, you can still make it.